Well, welcome to our panel discussion today on Marty Mann, the First Lady of Recovery Advocacy. My name is Greg Williams. I'm a person in long-term recovery. And for me, that means that I haven't used alcohol and drugs in over 20 years. And I'm really excited to be joined by Stacia Murphy, Sam Quinlan, and Tom Hill today. Each will share different reflections on Marty Mann and her journey to recovery. Stacia was the past president of the National Council of Alcoholism and Drug Dependence, has been a longtime recovery advocate, and she'll share some personal reflections. Each person will introduce themselves a little bit in their connection to Marty. Sam Quinlan is the Director of Innovations in Recovery for High Watch Recovery Center, where Marty went in with Bill and Lois in 1939. And Tom Hill is a recovery advocate. He has many hats. He also is an incredible fan of Marty Mann through the years, and has taught many other recovery advocates about Marty's journey, as has Stacia. So personally, I didn't know much about Marty Mann. I grew up in Connecticut, and my recovery journey started in Connecticut. And I actually used to attend a 12-step meeting that Marty's home group, where she lived 15 minutes from my house. And nobody really ever taught me about Marty Mann until I had the pleasure to embark on a project called The Anonymous People, a film that I was exploring the current recovery advocacy movement in the early 2000s and 2010s. But in that exploration, I sat down with people like Stacia and Tom Hill and other folks and Bill White, who really got me interested personally about Marty Mann and taught me about some history of the recovery movement that I had no idea about. And since that point, I've become really passionate about the importance of Marty's legacy, what she did for recovery advocacy and the broader addiction field in general. Her story, as you will hear, is really incredible and sensational. And I thought to get started today, I would just love to show a short clip of what we put in The Anonymous People in conjunction to Marty's story. So I will put that video clip up now.
I don't think the founders of 12-Step Fellowships ever intended people to think about anonymity the way they're thinking about it today. People think that they can't share with anybody that they're in recovery, and that's not what it's about.
This idea that certain fellowships are promoted by attraction rather than promotion. But how is one attracted to anybody within those fellowships if there's no knowledge that anyone is in recovery? So this segregation between the issue of anonymity at the level of press and the issue of anonymity as a spiritual principle and as sort of an antidote to self-centeredness, those are serious concerns that continue to need to be addressed. But anonymity is not secrecy, and anonymity does not prohibit the kind of advocacy that large numbers of people in these fellowships have done almost since their beginning.
The debate over anonymity and the idea that people in recovery should step out of the shadows of their anonymous support groups and push for widespread societal change has been around since the beginning of the AA era.
Alcoholism has too long been a taboo subject, just as tuberculosis used to be 40 years ago. We're trying to teach people the truth, that alcoholism is a disease, and that because it is a disease, it should have no stigma attached to it.
Marty Mann was doing recovery advocacy for many, many decades, and she was Bill Wilson's sponsee. She had Bill Wilson's blessing in doing the work she was doing, educating communities about the realities of alcoholism, and had really sort of set the stage for a lot of recovery advocacy that happened a few decades later.
Marty got sober after just horrendous time with alcohol and not understanding it was a disease. And she began traveling around the country with Dr. Bob and Bill W. And she experienced the stigma, no programs, no services for alcoholics and their families. And she said, this is terrible, we need to do something about it. And Bill and Dr. Bob said, we can't, but you can.
Alcoholics should be dealt with like other sick persons. in hospitals and clinics, not in jails. Alcoholism, America's fourth greatest public health problem, can be solved by community action. The National Committee stands ready to help your community plan such action.
Even as individuals began to develop the understanding they could advocate as individuals, but not as AA members, large numbers of AA members are going to be part of this alcoholism movement all across the country. And in essence, what they're going to try to do is fundamentally rewire how this country perceived and their attitudes towards alcoholism and its treatment.
So that was Marty in her own words, and Tom and Stacia as well. So at this point, I wanted to turn it over to Stacia Murphy to share some reflections of Marty's legacy, what Marty meant to her, and how she became interested in Marty Mann.
I really didn't know much about Marty Mann until I became involved with the National Council on Alcoholism, and was intrigued by her, who she was and what she did, her leadership, her vision, her insights, her understanding that it was a disease. I call it a complex medical problem, and the audiences she spoke with, starting with the doctors and the science, and then going into the research and the collaborations that she was able to form, and getting people to understand what we were facing as a disease, not a moral issue. Something could be done about it, but it needed a community of individuals of all disciplines to begin to address the stigma that was attached to being an alcoholic, being an Alcoholics Anonymous, that there was a way that there's no cure for it, but it certainly can be arrested. People can stop using alcohol, and then subsequently whatever else one uses in the form of drugs, and alcohol is a drug, and doing something about it, but not just for themselves, but for all those that are affected. And that affected community is extremely large when we think about disease. So her vision for that, her foresight, her understanding what we were up against and what we needed to do, and using education and the science and the research to promote that message, to get people interested, to get people involved, I think was extraordinary. It was genius. It was absolute genius, and speaks very much to who she was. And I simply did not replace Marty Mann. I simply continued the work as I saw it in the era in which I became involved with the council, with the National Council on Alcoholism, then became the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence. And what we continue to face, primarily the stigma, which was persistent. Not only was it persistent, but it was harmful in getting people to come to the table, though many did come, but there were so many others that did not come. But subsequently that has changed, and that primarily through education, getting people to understand. She was the pioneer, as far as I'm concerned, after Bill and Dr. Bob, to get us to understand what we were facing as a society, as a country, members of community, members of families, education, schools, children, complex medical problem.
And I know, Stacia, you had mentioned to me yesterday around her courage, the courage that she did what she did in the late 1930s, 1940s, on the heels of Prohibition, and being a woman at the time.
Enormous courage. First, being a woman, dealing with the stigma of a disease that people did not understand, being willing to be public, to talk about her own relationship with the disease, her own illness, her own alcoholism, and seeing it as important to educate a nation and beyond that. I think that took, because of the status of women, obviously the stigma attached to alcoholism, I think it was enormous act of courage to be selfless and putting herself out there as a public face, to change people's minds, to continue to reduce the stigma, to educate the public. I thought it was courageous and extraordinarily bold as a woman, and certainly as an alcoholic in recovery.
Well, yeah, thank you. And certainly that, when I first heard you describe her life to me, in that interview, that embodiment, and you've embodied that as well. And I think to better understand kind of how she came to this public persona, we have to understand a little bit about kind of where she came from. And so I wanted Sam Quinlan to introduce a little bit about her journey to Marty, and also kind of tell us a little bit about Marty's own recovery story, her own personal journey. So I'll turn it to Sam. Sam, we need to come off mute.
Thanks, Greg. Yes, thank you for the opportunity to speak about my own personal introduction to Marty Mann. And that came when I first visited High Watch back in 2017, and I was given an opportunity to go and sit in the chapel at High Watch and listen to her. I think it was the 25th anniversary share that she did, and that really was the beginning of it. And then I was handed David and Sally Brown's book, and and really the rest is a journey that I am on, and it's a privilege to be able to sit here and kind of really, I suppose, as you say, set the scene and kind of talk a little bit about the world that Marty was born into and what she experienced. And I mean, looking at these images here, we're going back to like the early 1900s. American nation had established itself as a world power. Business was booming, manufacturing was booming. You had Theodore Roosevelt was kind of elected full term in 1904 and was named a leader of the progressive movement. And in 1904, that very same year, in Chicago, Marty Mann was born to William and Lillian, who you can see in this first image. And she was close to her siblings. They were brought up in a, in a wealthy, affluent environment. They were very much looked after their nanny and probably left to kind of, play and be adventurous. And definitely, I think right from an early age, it became apparent that Marty had a flair. She was creative. She was spirited and willful. I think it was said that like from the age of 10, she knew she wanted to be a writer. And as that kind of went through her life, through her journalism, she was often kind of quoted on saying, that they can't write very well, but, what they're trying to achieve is great. And little did we know what she would go on to write about and the legacy that she would leave behind. That myself, as somebody in long-term recovery from alcoholism, her writing has had a profound effect on me and many of my friends and fellows in AA and in other fellowships. But she had all the advantages of wealth, of schools, of a society, of being a debutante. She could drink anyone, any woman, any man, apparently under the table. She was a force to be reckoned with. People, referred to her as having kind of hollow legs. In 1930, like in this whirlwind of being a socialite, the circles that she moved in, Marty decided that she was going to go to London and begin an international career. And she was a phenomenal journalist. She was a great photographer. She was incredibly artistic. In London, she moved with a set called the Bloomsbury set. She was friends with Virginia Woolf. She had her first very prominent relationship with Barbara Key Seymour, who was a well-known artist and photographer. And, you know, as great and high as it was, she'd been drinking hard for like 10 years. And it was suddenly like in 1932 that it took a real nosedive. And Marty reflects on the fact that that was probably to do with the loss of a great friend of hers from suicide. And the kind of guilt and shame that she had around that. And she really spiraled into her alcoholism. She says of that time that she was in complete darkness. And she does some very poignant writings, which are reflected in the Mrs. Marty Mann, the First Lady of Alcoholics Anonymous, written by Sally Brown and David Brown. There's some very poignant writing around that time. Still, she didn't stop drinking. And in 1935, she had the most awful accident in a blackout. She fell out of a second or third store window of a country house in England. She fractured both the hinges of her jaw. She lost her bottom teeth. She broke her leg and her hip and bit both of the sides of her tongue out. However, and so many people will be able to relate to that in recovery, even in convalescing from this horrific accident, she resumed excessive drinking. She didn't know how to stop. She wanted to stop. She was bargaining with it. And doing the geographics, it wasn't working in the UK. And a set of friends, she was penniless. She wasn't working. She sat, huddled in a park, and it was a group of friends that managed to raise the money to set her on her way to go back to New York. And in 1936, she did exactly that and did a 6-day binge on the Queen Mary. The only thing that was to interrupt her drinking binge was the fact that she docked home in New York and they carried her off on a stretcher, which is very famously kind of documented. From then until really she entered Bellevue, she never drew another sober breath, but she did in the moments of some clarity or absolute kind of obsession, wanting to know how and why she was like this. What was this mental illness? She did explore, she did go into hospital, and she was very fortunate. A fellow wealthy alcoholic neighbor introduced her to another big influence on her life, which was Dr. Robert Kennedy. And she stayed at Bellevue under his care, I think, for the best part of, 8 months. And it was from Bellevue. She didn't want to leave because she knew she would pick up a drink. She was terrified. But Dr. Kennedy was like, you need to get some answers. You need to have some understanding, and you need to be with people that can help you, because if you stay here, when you leave, you're going to pick up a drink. And he introduced her to who would be a huge influence on her and Bill Wilson and the early groups of Alcoholics Anonymous, and even sat on the board of Alcoholics Anonymous for a period of time. And that was Dr. Harry Tebow, who was at Blythewood, where she was for 15 months. I kind of want to mention a couple of things before I move on to how she was introduced to High Watch. 3 big things happened while she was at Blythewood, and that was one, that Dr. Tebow was given a copy of an unproduced manuscript, which was kind of a red-bound cover, and went to Marty and said, I think you need to read this. And this is the Alcoholics Anonymous. It became referred to lovingly as the big book, but he said, you need to read this. and she did read it. She struggled with it and she celebrated it. She was so happy that she finally knew what was wrong with her, alcoholism, that she was an alcoholic. And back then it was kind of, you know, it was an allergy of the body and an obsession of the mind. And she was thrilled that she could actually put a label on it. But at the same time, this book blocked her because she'd become resound to being an atheist, not religious, and it mentioned God. However, it was anger and resentment that finally kind of broke through. She saw one day, whatever was going on, there'd been an argument with a manager, something to do with money. She was fuming. And she saw these words, "We cannot live with anger." And that was it. The floodgates opened. She got to her knees. She grabbed her book. And to all intents and purposes, it was the first time she prayed. And that she prayed. And that was the breakthrough. And from that moment onwards, she would share with Dr. Thibault about what the book, she'd share it with others. And it was really Dr. Thibault that said, "Isn't it time that you go and meet these guys?" And intrepidly, she did. On April the 11th, 1939, she went to her first meeting at Clinton Street. She was kind of hosted by Horace Mayer. And at this meeting, where she was terrified, she was greeted by Bill and also by his wife, Lois. As Stacia said, Bill was Marty's sponsor, but really, the group took their lead from Bill. If Bill and Lois were welcoming this woman, because it was really unusual. Again, let's remember, this is like, World War II is happening. You've had Prohibition. You've got this amazingly elegant lady walking into this room of people that are struggling. They didn't believe that she could possibly be an alcoholic. And this is what Marty was up against. And I think really that's what got Marty, because she went home that night and what she said before she went to sleep was, "We are not alone anymore." And, the third and really important point that really brings me to how Marty became the one of the founding directors of High Watch Farm was through a chance meeting just as she was leaving. So in 1939, kind of around late fall, let's say, she was 7 months sober. She was still at Blythewood, and in through the doors on a stretcher comes Nona Wyman, and they have a chance passing, but it was through Dr. Thibault and some others that she was asked on leaving Blythewood to kind of come back and visit Nona, not necessarily to talk about AA or anything, but just to check in, always having her big book just in case the opportunity arose. Anyway, on one of these visits, she found out that Nona had actually escaped and had gone to New York. They managed to find her hauled up in a hotel somewhere. And it was there that Nona, in some incredible moment of a sober sanity, told Marty about this incredible place up in Kent, Connecticut, called Joy Farm, that was run by this wonderful woman called Sister Frances, and that she needed to go there and she needed to take her small group of AA founders and the beginning members of AA up there, because she was sure, like herself and her husband, whenever they were there, they managed to stay sober. So there was something magical, and she was sure that Sister Frances and the AA founders would find a commonality. And so really, kind of almost immediately, Marty, the universe is aligned, and Marty and Bill and Lois and a couple of other members of AA went up to Joy Farm, met Sister Francis, and they had this amazing weekend. As Bill got out of the car, he said to Marty, he said, "You can cut the atmosphere with a knife." And he was talking about that essence of spirituality, that cup of hope that was at Joy Farm and is still there today, because what transpired from that weekend was Sister Francis handing over Joy Farm to Alcoholics Anonymous. Obviously, Bill, in tradition, said we cannot accept this, but maybe a good thing would be to set up the High Watch board, the High Watch farm, and it could run as its own, and we could send people that were struggling to get well up to High Watch. And that's exactly what did happen. High Watch farm was evolved. Marty was one of the founding directors, and High Watch really was the first ever 12-step residential retreat.
Thank you so much. It was that was wonderful. The her journey and then obviously the what she did at High Watch, and then what that has meant for the addiction field and other people who've kind of built institutions like that in that image has been spectacular. It's and for me, living in Connecticut, I used to go up to High Watch and not really know some of this history. So it's been just so much fun to, over the last couple of years, really learn about Marty's legacy within Connecticut and at High Watch. And, as with everything in history, the white heterosexual males get the credit when it was really Marty who should get the credit and deliver that. And I think somebody who can really speak to that a little bit about what Marty did from that point on, but also how that education piece kind of came is and Tom has taught me a lot about what Marty did for the field and what her ripple effects of recovery advocacy today. So Tom Hill, please take it away and tell us a little bit about your reflections on Marty Mann's life as it relates to our world today.
Thank you, Greg. And thanks so much for putting this panel together. It's really thrilled to be able to be a part of something that honors Marty Mann. So when I first started doing recovery advocacy over 20 years ago, that's when I first became aware of the historic work of Marty Mann. And so I was working at the LGBT Community Center in New York City and running a program called Speak Out, LGBT Voices for Recovery. And we put together this big event, and Stacia Murphy, who's with us today, was our keynote speaker. And, she spoke before a packed crowd, and she talked, among other things, she talked about Marty Mann. And so I was just intrigued because I didn't know who that was. And afterwards, I talked to Stacia, and she said, well, Sally and David Brown were putting together this book, and it wasn't out yet, but it was going to be out soon. And it was a biography of Marty Mann. So I contacted Sally Brown, and I said, they were in, I think, Los Angeles. I said, will you guys come out to New York City and speak with this group about the life of Marty Mann? Because the big thing was that in the book, it revealed her life as a lesbian, as well as an alcoholic and a advocate. So, also during this time, my colleagues and I, we were facing all kinds of challenges related to organizing the recovery community around disclosure and anonymity, about changing public policy and public perceptions about addiction and alcoholism, and learning about Marty Mann, that she had single-handedly tackled many of these issues. It gave us not only hope, but courage, and also provided us with milestones that had been created by her experience, her wisdom, her action. So, we know that early in her recovery, Marty returned to work, and she was looking for something meaningful to do. As Sam told us, she had, a background in journalism and public relations, and she wanted to do something to be helpful to other alcoholics. So during this time, she also became aligned with the Yale Center of Alcohol Studies. That was an emerging research institute, and it was directed by a doctor named E.M. Jelinek. And the center was helping to support the disease model of addiction. And Marty wanted to be able to leverage this to change public perceptions about alcoholism. So in 1994, I think Stacia mentioned, Marty founded the National Committee for the Education of Alcoholism, NCEA. That later became the National Council on Alcoholism, NCA, and then even later, the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence, NCADD. So, she assembled this campaign to address the stigma and ignorance surrounding alcoholism, using the disease model to counter the prevailing attitudes at that time of alcoholism was a moral failing. The disease model was pretty controversial, though, even in the medical community, and yet Marty persisted in her advocacy, emphasizing that alcoholism as an illness with roots in genetics and biology. So she based her campaign on like other public health movements, such as the one focused on tuberculosis and diabetes. And she often compared alcoholism to diabetes, insisting that an alcoholic should not be blamed for their body's reaction to alcohol in the same way that a person with diabetes is not considered a moral failure because of their need for insulin. So her message was built on three basic ideas. The first one, alcoholism is a disease and the alcoholic is a sick person. The second, the alcoholic can be helped and is worth helping. And the third, that alcoholism is a public health problem and therefore a public responsibility. Now, if you think that those three basic ideas that were developed in the 1940s and furthered in the 50s and 60s, like those are still messages that we're trying to get across today. And that's both heartening, but it's also sort of sad that these are still the challenges that we're facing. But she articulated these things early on. And she wrote a health manual entitled The Primer on Alcoholism, How People Drink and How to Recognize Alcoholics. And then through the National Council on Alcoholism, she conducted speaking tours across the country that were based on these strategies. Stirring public interest in alcoholism and conducting public education campaigns based on science and medical information, again, very pertinent today. Engaging the medical profession in the treatment of alcoholics, emphasizing that alcoholism was a medical and not a moral problem, again, relevant today. And providing information and education to national press, general public, business, universities, and medical associations, all stakeholders that we deal with today. So we know that she was a very charismatic public speaker. She gave hundreds and hundreds of lectures and served as a consultant to congressional and state legislative committees. And she was when she did public speaking, she offered personal details selectively in speeches and interviews to reinforce her public health message. And this is a lot of stuff we've developed in this phase of recovery advocacy, creating personal stories and connecting them to advocacy issues. But I also want to point out that she was involved in some early controversy, and there were folks in AA that felt that she was breaking anonymity because she was so excited about the work she was doing and also the growing AA movement that she wanted to talk about herself as an alcoholic and an AA member. So she had to sort of roll it back a little bit, and again, taught us many important lessons about how to disclose in a way that we can still be anonymous if we're affiliated with 12-step programs. So also want to just talk about the fact that she was not only one of the first women to join AA, but she found that other women were reluctant to seek help. And so you have to remember, at that time, many people believed that alcohol use disorder among women was underlying with psychiatric problems, and that alcohol use problems were more pathological among women than men. So this was a prevailing attitude at the time. And it's also important to know that, coming out as an alcoholic really put a person
their reputation, their career, their family relationships in jeopardy. But the risks for women were especially great. And I think Stacia pointed that out also. Alcoholic women could be particularly visible since they seem exceptional in a standout kind of way, but they also did not fit easily into research studies, into treatment protocols, or in the public understanding of the kind of person who developed this kind of condition. So according to our friend Bill White, I'm going to quote him, Marty Mann had obvious assets to devote to her campaign of public education and public advocacy. She was bright, articulate, attractive, passionately committed to offer her own life to thousands of audiences as living proof of the reality and transformative power of recovery from alcoholism. And that power of example, I think, is really, really important for somebody, again, who had the courage to stand up and do that at a time when it really was not publicly acceptable to do that. So it's important to understand the courage of Marty as a woman who identified as a quote unquote recovered alcoholic, and that she strategically chose to disclose what to disclose and what not to disclose. And because of the time she lived in and the protection of her credibility as an advocate, she kept her life as a lesbian in a committed relationship as an open secret. And that was, again, the sign of the times. To disclose that would not only have been the end of her career, but it would have been an unthinkable thing for anyone to do at that time, when you could be arrested, when you could have you could be institutionalized, when really detrimental things could happen as opposed to coming out during that time. That happened much, much later. So I do want to say that, having worked at the LGBT Community Center and having run that queer recovery program, that there were many of us who read between the lines, even before the biography came out, and saw the indication of her sexual identity long before it was publicly revealed. And that, for me and for many, many other LGBT people in recovery and recovery advocates, that was a really important thing to identify with Marty and again, her courage. So, I just want to end by saying that Marty was a pioneer, that we laud and praise the work she did, and that if you look at many of her things, you have to look at the language of the time. You have to look at the fact that she talked about alcoholism, and we talk about addiction in a much more broader way now. But the themes are all still there, and that we can still learn so much from her power of example and the courage that she had to stand up and talk about her life in a way that really did move the dial forward, and we're still moving it now. So there are just many lessons that we can learn from her example, and I'm just so proud that she's part of our legacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's the idea that we're still kind of grappling with some of the issues that she advocated for in the 1940s is really astounding. I mean, it's one thing that I stumbled upon in the filmmaking was another character from our history, Harold Hughes, who was this senator who was in recovery himself, and he was able to get the first ever subcommittee hearings on alcoholism. And here we are in 2021, just having, we have a number of public people in recovery in the presidential cabinet and in the administration, and who talk about their recovery on Capitol Hill. But as Harold Hughes, who in the 90s, tried to kind of continue this legacy, said, the first hearing that we ever had in the United States Senate, Bill Wilson, who's pictured here, and Marty, the first lady of Alcoholics Anonymous, both testified. Bill Wilson testified under anonymity, and he wasn't photographed, because he testified on behalf of Alcoholics Anonymous. Marty Mann testified as, the founder of National Council on Alcoholism and the executive director. And so she was publicly disclosed in all the news articles around it. But you read the transcript from this day, it's worth reading. It's were still grappling with so many of these issues, but what they were doing in the 1960s, on this front, and some of the ripple effects of the policy and the advocacy, even the funding, we're working on funding to states and local communities. A lot of the seeds of that funding started right here with Marty Mann's work, and she was the chief architect of all of this, and getting Hughes and Bill and all of them to do it. It was Marty who was the instigator behind all of it. And then one really just poignant moment that I, as a storyteller, and one really dramatic moment, and this is a way that we'll kind of end. And I made a film about current events of the recovery advocacy movement, and I will tell you this 4-minute section of the film about Operation Understanding and what she did. And it still today hasn't been, matched or paralleled. We attempted a little bit, in 2015 on the National Mall, but what she accomplished, when you take yourself back to 1976 and the names that are on this list here, from Brinkley Smithers to Don Newcomb to Gary Moore, and you read about who those people were at that time. It's remarkable who was in that room this day, and she put them together. So I will let Marty tell the story along with some other folks about Operation Understanding. So I will play that clip now.
Which really set the stage for a really dramatic moment in the history of advocacy in the country, which was a project called Operation Understanding in 1976.
The National Council on Alcoholism brought 50 people here, all distinguished in various fields, including politics, sports, and entertainment. All are recovered alcoholics, and this is the first time some of them have publicly revealed their problem.
NCA was founded by a woman who is an alcoholic. Not was, but is. Although I stopped drinking over 35 years ago.
I've had pink fingers pointed at me now for 15 years, either because I was drunk or because I was sober. I'm sort of getting tired of the finger being pointed at me. But if the finger that points at me will help somebody else get sober, I'm not ashamed of it.
It was a phenomenal event and included people like astronaut Buzz Aldrin, included actors like Dick Van Dyke and Gary Moore, baseball stars like Don Newcomb and Ryan Duran, politicians like Congressman Wilbur Mills, Senator Harold Hughes, and others.
People who this country dearly loved, and were so shocked to see these individuals sort of stepping out of the shadows and announcing themselves as people in recovery. An enormous turning point in the history of not only advocacy, but in the history of attitudes towards alcoholism.
I think that all these illustrious individuals who are here are hoping that the stigma that's always been attached throughout history to the disease of alcoholism will be somewhat removed. This might be the beginning. It is a disease.
There was folks tired of being blamed and being shamed and wanting very much to be seen in a positive light, angry, because advocacy is about anger, and knowing that by their voices being heard around the world, you give voice to others.
The message here today is that alcoholism is a treatable disease, one without a stigma that can afflict anyone.
Yeah, I told Stacia the other day that the most quoted line I get from people who see the anonymous people, and Stacia, you're on mute, but I'm gonna give you the microphone for your closing reflections. The most quoted line I get from people around the country is advocacy is about anger. And so, Stacia, can you unpack that just for a little bit in the context of Marty, and what do you mean when you say advocacy is about anger?
Well, what I mean by that is you recognize that there is a problem, and it's not a part of a chorus of voices who have experienced it, feel the outrage because things aren't being doubted, and speak out, educate, get angry, raise a little hell. I think it's an American tradition. If you think about it, it's what we do to make change happen, to get people's attention, to get people interested, to get people listening, and thinking, and what does this mean to my life, and why? What can I do to change it? But there has to be this outrage that there's something wrong here, and we have an opportunity to do something about it. One of the things I want to also say, we don't deal with the issue of classism in addiction and sobriety, and we have adopted an attitude that people who have problems are the problem, rather than they do have problems that are solvable. And I think that's the sort of an underlying current. And when we deal with alcoholism, and I think it's a strong advocacy platform to talk about that. People have problems, people can change, but you have to create the will for that. You have to create the will for it, and advocacy is about helping create the will to have people do something that changes the current, changes the flow of the water, speaks to hearts and minds, and brings a thinking that moves us forward to solving problems, and particularly one of the most prominent ones in this country, and actually in the world.
Yeah. And Marty was a troublemaker, and
oh yeah,
she ruffled feathers. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Sam, do you want to have any closing reflections about Marty or Marty's life, takeaways for people learning about her today for the first time?
It's been a pleasure, and it's such an honor to hear Stacia speaking and Tom. And I just think at this time, thank you, Stacia. It's just a pleasure to meet you. And
thank you so much.
I think at this time when we're really, as a global community, beginning to appreciate what taking, cultural responsibility is, and what the burden of legacy is, and a time when we're really going at it against the elements, against the environmental elements and everything. Solidarity. It comes back to that clip. It comes back to Operation Understanding, and what a force that was. And like you say, it hasn't necessarily been matched since, although I beg to differ. I do think what you created on the National Mall, Greg, needs to be really celebrated. It was, it was a huge moment, and thank you for the work that you do. But moving forward, we need more of that. And I think there are people out there that are really talking about the work that Marty did as a woman in recovery, as a woman that, publicly or privately at a time, was open about being gay, and celebrated being part of an incredible LGBTQ community. We just need to keep it up, keep the hard work up. And I couldn't agree more with what Stacia says around, advocacy and anger. But out of it comes celebration, out of it comes great gifts of really being able to be part of something that means change, reduction of stigma. And it's an honor to be here doing that today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
And Tom, your last words.
Yeah, I'm going to try to be brief. What we have in front of us right now with, a rising overdose epidemic, has brought home once again the seriousness of alcoholism and addiction and all the things that lurk behind it, and that we are living proof that recovery happens, and that it's an expectation, and that we have a responsibility to move this forward. Marty, decades before I came on the scene, forged such important ground. And I just, it's like, we have come so far since then, and we have so far to go until we get this done, until people really understand what addiction is about, and that there's answers for it. So Marty passed the torch to us. We pass it to the next generations down, and hope that people will continue to do this work as important recovery advocates, and really make some substantive change in the lives of many, many people. So our work is cut out for us.
All right. Well, thank you. And thank you to everybody for taking the time to relive, the emotional journey of Marty's life. And thanks to the folks tuning in. She's a special person to all of us, and hopefully to all of you. I think, for me, it's, if we don't remember our history, we're doomed to repeat it. And the more you read Sally and David Brown's book, the more you read about Marty Mann, the more you read about recovery advocacy and ups and downs. We're struggling with still some things that ground that's been covered. There's been some ground that's covered. There's a lot we can learn from those early pioneers on this effort in the intersection of recovery advocacy, personal recovery, the addiction field, professionally, and all of those, triply compounded identities, as Kaylee Aviv coined in a recent thesis she wrote about Marty's life. So thank you for tuning in, and please do grab a copy of the biography of Mrs. Marty Mann, as it's worth the read, and it reads like a film screenplay. So thank you all.
Thank you.